Hi YouTube, and welcome to the second in my series of 6 degrees of book separation, a variation on the tag of the same, but I've slightly tailored it to my needs because I have a new novel coming out in July called 3 Dreams in the Key of G, and I'm doing six versions of the 6 degrees tag because the first book in each chain had some input or influence on my own novel. And then I'm going to trace a chain of books leading out from that. The other 5 didn't necessarily inform my novel, but that's what this series is. And today we start with a book. I don't have the actual physical copy because I think I must have got it out of the library. And that is Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker, which is basically another one of Dawkins's arguments against the existence of God through the elegance of sort of genetics and biological design and origin of species theory by Darwin. And he starts the book by sort of saying that the main argument in favour of God over biology is the elegance of God's design. It could only be a divine hand at work. And Dawkins goes, well, no, I mean, what about the elegance of origin of species and the theory of evolution? It is such a simple concept at the heart of all the biological complexity and diversity that it generates. That is the only design. It is the blind design of genes, which is obviously quite fundamental to my book because I do talk about the human genome that is at the heart of all of us. And indeed, the epigram to my novel, that is the little sort of quotation at the start of the novel, is from this book. And I'm just going to read that to you. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. So you can see that Dawkins is sort of fairly central to my book. I mean, one of the themes is that one of the main characters is a young mother in Northern Ireland just after the peace agreement has come into force. And it asks the question of, we're obsessed with, is it nature, is it nurture? One of the things about the Human Genome Project is, as we uncover the wisdom of the genes and we can see, is there a gene for, this disease or that disease and, all that sort of thing. But, what is nature, what is nurture? And one of the things my book looks at is, well, is there any real difference between nature and nurture? If you are brought up in a conflict zone such as Northern Ireland was before the peace agreement, where when you are born into a household you are straight away on one side or the other, your allegiance is determined for you, your parental nurturing will inevitably ensure that you are loyal to the cause, be it of republicanism or loyalism. Therefore, you have your parents' genes, but you also have their parenting. And when their parenting is so fixed because of their allegiance, it asks the question, is there any difference between nature and nurture in such a circumstance? So that's the first book, Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker. And on to the second one, Blindness by Jose Saramago, which is obviously the theme from Blind Watchmaker to Blindness. So this is a brilliant little novel about a disease suddenly descends upon mankind and turns everyone blind, with a few exceptions, one of whom is a woman who spends the novel leading 6 people, including her blind husband. They're all blind other than her. She's trying to guide them and steer them through the chaos that ensues, as even a simple task such as obtaining food in order to feed yourself to stay alive, when you're blind, suddenly blind, just takes on an enormity, and people are plunged into sort of ignorance because they can't see anything and they're not, they can't rely on other people to do it for them. So mankind descends into his own basis nature of sort of like any other sort of animal hunting for food, and this woman is desperately trying to protect these people, a little group of 6, amongst all the chaos. And this is a brilliant sort of apocalyptic novel. Jose Saramago, Blindness. And on to the third novel, The Flame Alphabet by Ben Marcus, which is a novel I've talked about in other places. So we have another sort of epidemic that has descended upon mankind, as we did with the blindness in Saramago. In this case, though, it affects language. And what it is that the language of youth, of teenagers, not mortally, but devastatingly wounds, injures and harms adults. So it's not just the metaphorical thing of the struggle between youth and their parents, where youth says sort of hurtful things and sort of seem totally ungrateful, and they throw everything back in their parents' faces. Yes, it's a metaphor for that, but this is an actual physical manifestation of disease, of injury, of harm that befalls adults when their children reach a certain age and start using language in their proximity, and it is language as a virus that can infect. The youth are left unaffected, but the parents will be struck by this language and afflicted, and for their own safety, the two main protagonists in this, a husband and wife, are evacuated once the disease strikes their town. And it's terribly poignant. The mother pines for her child, even though the child can only but wound, and injure her. And they're in this sort of evacuation centre, and it's just so miserable, and it's just so touching. It's a deeply profound book. So that's the third book, The Flame Alphabet by Ben Marcus. Fourth book, Alphabet City. So obviously the link is from Alphabet, from the Flame Alphabet to Alphabet City. This is by Stephen Knight, who I've talked about before. Stephen Knight started off as a novelist, and this is one of his early, if not his first novel. And it's a great little book. But what Stephen Knight is known for since is he's a Hollywood filmmaker. He writes scripts for Hollywood. He also writes TV scripts at Peaky Blindness. Those in the UK will know, a very popular sort of crime drama series. Historical crime drama series, but he is also the originator of the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So Stephen Knight has gone on to much bigger things than being a novelist, which is a shame because he's a great novelist. And in this book, Alphabet City, so it's named after that section of New York where Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, which is known as Alphabet City for obvious reasons. And the protagonist of this book has written a sociological study of this very deprived area in the 80s New York. Only he never set foot in it. It's all made up. It's a fiction. And what happens is that some of the events that he wrote about, some of the crime and the murders and stuff, seem to start coming true. So when he sort of said, oh, this bloke was killed and his body was hidden, after all this time, after the book's published, suddenly they discover the body. But the protagonist knows that none of this is true. It's all come out of his head, and yet these things seem to be coming into reality. Now, is it the police and the FBI who are very interested in his book because they want to nail a drug kingpin of Alphabet City, and they think that Stephen Knight has got evidence of these crimes, but of course he hasn't. And one of the questions is: are the FBI making these things come true in order to manipulate the protagonists to give evidence, even though they know these things are false? Or is it the drug kingpin, who himself is a real character, is on the trail of the protagonist because he thinks that this guy has got evidence that can nail him? It's a very clever book. And, I highly recommend it. So that is Alphabet City by Stephen Knight. And so from the theme of one city to another, or is it two cities? This is The City in the City by Mieville, which talks about a divided city, divided by race, ethnicity and religion. And I think it's based on the former Yugoslavia, and was recently done as a BBC drama series. And the architecture of the city is very much sort of embodies the prohibition on the one ethnic group within its environs interacting with the others. So literally, there are laws that mean you must look down, as you're passing the other community, because of the nature of the architecture. It's sort of, they're sort of wind and sort of intermittent with each other. You're not allowed to look at them. You have to bow your head. When you're travelling on the subway, there's a sort of a technological device that blurs your vision as you pass, again, the other community. And it is very much about a divided city. It's very clever about the architecture, how the architecture embodies the nature of division and separation, and how the laws have grown up around that. The second half of the book sort of tails off into a rather pedestrian detective story, which, you know, but basically a body is found in the other half of the city. So, you know, that body is in the wrong half, which sets off all sorts of, you know, diplomatic issues in even investigating it. So it's a great premise, but then the second half, you know, the first half establishes this amazing city and the architecture. The second half is just a detective story. So it kind of gets a bit disappointing. And interestingly, the TV series of it, exactly the same. First couple of episodes brilliantly establishing, you know, this very strange landscape, urban landscape, because of the laws that are wrapped around it. And then just becomes a detective story. And finally, still on the notion of divided space, urban space, this is Rupert Thomson, Divided Kingdom, where Thomson takes the UK and divides it into 4 separate zones based on personality types. And the model he uses for that is the Jacobean humour system, which Shakespeare was very fond of. So there are 4 essential fluids in the body. There's black bile, yellow bile, what are the other 2? Blood, and I think phlegm is the other. And, you know, in the Jacobean humour system, if you had an excess of one over the others, it would determine your personality type. So if, for example, you had more black bile than the others, that would make you melancholy. If you had more blood than the others, that would make you sanguine. If you had an overbalance of phlegm, that would make you phlegmatic, and all this sort of thing. And Thomson does a similar sort of thing here, dividing the UK, where because everybody's at each other's throats, the only way to maintain peace is to put all the personality types of one type together in one section of the kingdom, and all, you know, another one in another. And the book basically is there's one individual who's basically taking a tour of the UK, an illegal tour, because you're not allowed really in any of the other zones outside of your own, and you know, comes to introduce us to, you know, to the quite unpleasant behaviour of people in each of their zones. Because when you're sort of cooped up with people with exactly the same personality type, it doesn't make for a peace. It makes for even more animosity. So that is my second 6 degrees of separation chain. So we've gone from Richard Dawkins, The Blind Watchmaker, through to Jose Saramago's Blindness, to Ben Marcus's The Flame Alphabet, to Stephen Knight's Alphabet City, to China Mieville's The City and the City, and finally Rupert Thomson, Divided Kingdom, which, you know, is, although I say that the 5 books following on from the first do not particularly relate to my novel, I suppose there is an element of Divided Kingdom in the province of Northern Ireland. You know, they are notionally both British, you know, whichever side of the divide you're on, they are, for the moment anyway, both British citizens, and yet there's this sort of huge animosity, huge division, which hopefully the peace agreement is slowly, with the generations, erasing that separation, but we'll have to see. So there you have it, my second 6 degrees of separation. So until the third, thanks very much.